Howdy, Pima, Aztecs. So this is a video on chapter 13, the peripheral nervous system, part 3. It's the nerves. Let's give a little check with our pen. So we're in the peripheral nervous system, as I said. Two major divisions of the peripheral nervous system are the sensory afferent division, and the other one is the motor efferent division. So remember, sensory afferent, you're bringing electrical signals from the periphery to the central nervous system. In the motor efferent division, you're sending signals, electrical signals from the central nervous system out to the peripheral nervous system. And then you have somatic afferent, sensory afferent neurons. Those would come from the skin or skeletal muscle or joints. And then you have visceral sensory afferent neurons. Those would come from the viscera, so the heart, the lungs, the GI tract. And then the motor efferent division, you would have somatic motor efferent neurons, and those would be motor neurons that would go out to effectors like skeletal muscle. And then the visceral motor efferent neurons would go to the viscera, so the heart and the lungs, etc. All right, so now we've kind of looked at spinal nerves, and we talked about them, I think, in the last video. It's kind of a review, but let's take a look. So this is a cross section of the spinal cord. Out here in the periphery is a vertebra, right? So this is a vertebra, and then here's another vertebra. And this blue stuff in between is cartilage. So there's cartilage disc. Now back to the spinal cord. We talked about this in the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, but in the brain, the gray matter is superficial and the white matter is deep. In the spinal cord, the gray matter is deep and the white matter is superficial. So the gray, and then the gray matter has horns in the spinal cord. So because this is ventral and this is dorsal, then this horn, so there's two horns, there's one here and one here, those would be the ventral horns of the gray matter in the spinal cord. And then back here, these two guys would be the dorsal horns of the gray matter in the spinal cord. And then here's the lateral horns of the gray matter in the spinal cord. If you are, for example, a lower motor neuron traveling out to the periphery, your cell body would be here in the ventral horn of the gray matter, and then your axon would exit here in these rootlets. So isn't that a cute name? Or they're actually rootlets of the spinal nerve. So now we're going to talk about spinal nerves, but spinal nerves have different parts and they branch a lot. So all these rootlets of the spinal nerve, so these would be the ventral rootlets of the spinal nerve, and then back here would be the dorsal rootlets of the spinal nerve. But you can see that the ventral rootlets of the spinal nerve converge, they all come together to form a ventral root of the spinal nerve. Same thing with the dorsal rootlets of the spinal nerve. All these dorsal rootlets will converge to form the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. And then the dorsal root of the spinal nerve and the ventral root of the spinal nerve will come together right here to make the spinal nerve. And then the spinal nerve will branch into the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve and the dorsal ramus of the spinal nerve. And then you have these sympathetic trunk ganglia, or singular, this is a sympathetic trunk ganglion. Here's one here. And if you remember, a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. And we'll talk more about these sympathetic trunk ganglia when we do the autonomic nervous system, because we're going to do the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Oh, one more thing. Where the spinal nerve has this dorsal swelling, this piece right here is called the dorsal root ganglion, or the DRG. And if anybody can remember what lives in there, I'd be impressed. Of course, you can't tell me, but if you said the cell bodies of sensory afferent neurons, you would be right. Give yourself a pat on the back. Okay, so this is just these are tracks. So this is a review. Remember, nerves are collections of axons / fibers in the peripheral nervous system. Tracks are collections of axons in the central nervous system. So this just shows, here's a foot. So you're lighting a match to somebody's foot here. Like, who does that? But anyway, it's in the cartoon. And then here you've broken a bottle, I guess, and there's a piece of glass and there's pain receptors. But either way, they're these sensory afferent neurons, and actually they're first order sensory afferent neurons. They'll do a graded potential in here, and if the pain is great enough, or down here if the heat is great enough, that graded potential out here in the dendrites, so these pieces out here are the dendrites, the graded potential causes a depolarization event greater than -55 millivolts, you will fire an action potential in the axon of these first order sensory neurons. So let's look at the pain one. So here's the axon of first order sensory neuron. Action potentials are traveling along the axon, and this piece right here is the dorsal root ganglion. So, and then this little guy right here is the cell body of a sensory afferent neuron. So the information about pain will travel along the axon. It will go into the spinal cord. It will synapse with a second order sensory afferent neuron, and that second order sensory afferent neuron will cross over or decussate, and that information will travel in the form of an action potential up the spinal cord. Sorry, this is really bad with this mouth. And then you'll get a synapse between the second order sensory afferent neurons and the third order sensory neurons here. And then here's your somatosensory cortex. So at that point, when the information has traveled to the somatosensory cortex, you will feel the pain or the heat. And all this information just travels in tracks, and the tracks have names. For example, the lemniscus tract, the lateral spinothalamo tract. And then if you want to send a motor command, so if you want to flex your bicep to pick up a glass of water, that upper motor neuron will fire an action potential. Action potential will travel down through the spinal cord. It will cross over or decussate in the medulla, and then the first order motor neuron will continue to travel through the spinal cord, and it will synapse with a lower motor neuron. Sorry, I think I called it a first order, but in the motor pathways, it's an upper motor neuron will synapse here with the lower motor neuron, and then the lower motor neuron will send an action potential out to skeletal muscles and the neuromuscular junction, and hopefully you know the rest of the story on that. All right, so what is the structure of a nerve? So we've been saying that a nerve is a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system. But now we're going to say a nerve is a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system, but it's enclosed by connective tissue. And so here's the cartoon. Here's our axons with myelin sheath, and these are all axons. All these blue dots in here are axons, and they're covered with a myelin sheath. And then superficial to the myelin sheath is this thing called the endoneurium. And then if you have a whole bunch of axons enclosed in this thing called a fascicle, and and you have connective tissue around a fascicle. That connective tissue is called the perineurium. And then if you have a whole bunch of fascicles together, wrapped up in connective tissue, that connective tissue is called the epineurium. So this kind of looks like, I don't know if you remember in muscle, the endomysium, the paramecium, and the epimecium. It's the same motif. This is I think this is probably a scanning electron micrograph of a nerve. So the endoneurium would surround each axon. So you can see there's a whole bunch of axons in here. And then what I can kind of tell, yeah, this looks like it would be a fascicle. So one fascicle. Fascicles are covered by connective tissue called the perineurium. And then on the outside of the entire nerve would be the epineurium. So this cartoon again shows here's our cross section of our spinal cord, and then let's get our bearings. So this is the ventral part of the cord. This is the dorsal part of the cord, and then in this cartoon we've got our dorsal horns of the gray matter of the spinal cord. Actually this is the ventral horn, and then this thing here would be the lateral horn. And so we see out in, let's go to the left side of the cartoon. So here's dendrites of our sensory afferent neurons. So these dendrites would detect some stimulus. So for example, pain or temperature. And if the graded potential in the dendrites reached greater than minus 55 millivolts, you'd fire an action potential along the peripheral axon. So afferent transmission of the peripheral along the peripheral axon, and then once that action potential goes past the cell body, you'd be in the central axon or the central process. And you can see here that sensory afferent neuron is synapsing with this green thing, which is an interneuron. And then so you'd have a synapse. So wherever there's a synapse, you're going to have neurotransmitters. And then that interneuron would also synapse with a lower motor neuron, and here's the cell body, the lower motor neuron, and that would that information would travel as an action potential along the motor neuron out to your effectors. So if a skeletal muscle was here, these would be the axon terminals of the lower motor neuron, and you'd form a neuromuscular junction here. So this is just the same cartoon that we talked about with the epineurium, the perineurium, and the endoneurium. And some definitions. A nerve is a bundle of nerve fibers / axons. Fibers are the same things as axons. They're held together by layers of connective tissue. Connective tissue from superficial to deep is epineurium, perineurium, and endoneurium. Now, here's a new piece of information. Nerves can be sensory, motor, or mixed, carrying both sensory and motor fibers. So, for example, if this was a cartoon of a purely motor nerve, all these axons would be lower motor neurons traveling to a skeletal muscle, for example. If this nerve were a purely sensory nerve, then all these axons would be sensory afferent axons, and all the information would be traveling from the periphery to the central nervous system. Some nerves are mixed, so maybe one fascicle would be sensory afferent neurons, and this fascicle would be axons of motor efferent neurons. Most of the nerves in our body are mixed nerves. And they carry somatic sensory and somatic motor fibers. So hopefully remember, whenever you see somatic, you're thinking skeletal muscle, joints, and skin. Other nerves can carry visceral sensory axons and visceral motor axons. If they're going to and from the viscera, so heart, lungs, GI tract. Pure sensory or pure motor nerves are rare, but there are a few, and we'll talk about them. Okay, so we've seen this cartoon before, and I've got the dorsal root ganglion circled. So just remember, ganglia in the peripheral nervous system are structures that contain neuron cell bodies. These dorsal root ganglia, so here's a dorsal root ganglia, here's a dorsal root ganglia, dorsal root ganglia, dorsal root ganglia. They specifically contain sensory afferent neuron cell bodies, so sensory afferent neuron cell bodies, not motor efferent. Oh, and specifically they're somatic sensory afferent neuron cell bodies. So they're coming from a muscle, a joint, or the skin, carrying sensory afferent information. These guys here, these are autonomic ganglia. So they're both ganglia, but these guys are autonomic ganglia. And they contain visceral motor efferent neuron cell bodies. So these are cell bodies of motor efferent neurons that are going to go to the viscera, so the heart, lung, GI tract. You can, if you damage a nerve in the peripheral nervous system, you can regenerate it. Not so much in the central nervous system, but let's take a look at this cartoon. So here's a neuron, here's a cell body, these projections are dendrites. Here's the axon, myelinated axon, and then you enlarge this piece and you see that it was damaged. So this myelin sheath here was torn, and then these are fragments of the axon. So if the axon of a peripheral neuron, so not a central nervous system neuron, but a peripheral neuron is damaged and the soma or cell body is still intact, its axon can regenerate using the cells that make up the myelin sheath called Schwann cells. And these Schwann cells will form these things called regeneration tubes, and then the tubes will secrete growth factors, and you can grow a new axon. There's also macrophages there to remove the debris. So all these fragments of axons and the fragments of the myelin, macrophages move in there and remove the debris. And I said that this does not occur in the CNS. So this just shows what we were talking about. The endoneurium is out here wrapping the entire axon. The axon becomes fragmented at the injury site. Oh, and these are droplets of myelin. So torn myelin, droplets of myelin. The macrophages come in here. So this is a macrophage. It's engulfing that piece of axon. And then the axon will sprout or grow filaments through a regeneration tube. So here's the axon. It's growing these sprouts, and they'll hook up with the other part of the axon that was torn. The Schwann cells are aligning to form the regeneration tube to regenerate the nerve. And then the axon completely regenerates, so you have a single axon, and you get a new myelin sheath forming with the Schwann cells. Woohoo, you just fixed your nerve. So spinal nerves don't have specific names, or each nerve doesn't have a name like the cranial nerves, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but spinal nerves, there's 31 pairs of mixed nerves. So hopefully you remember what a mixed nerve contains. It contains axons of sensory afferent neurons and axons of motor efferent neurons together. It's a mixed nerve. And the mixed nerves are named according to where they extend from the spinal cord. So you have 8 cervical spinal nerves. You have 12 thoracic spinal nerves. And it tells you here which vertebrae. So for example, the 8 cervical nerves are associated with vertebra C1 through 8. the 12 thoracic spinal nerves are associated with T1 through 12 in the spinal column. And then you have 5 lumbar spinal nerves, L1 through L5 in the spinal column. You have 5 sacral nerves and 1 coccygeal nerve. All right, so we've seen this cartoon before. So here's these little guys are the rootlets. Here's the ventral root of the spinal nerve. Actually, I should say these are the rootlets of the spinal nerve. This is the ventral root of the spinal nerve. This is the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. When they come together, they form a spinal nerve, and then that spinal nerve branches into a ventral and a dorsal ramus. So now let's think about a question here. If the ventral root, so right here, if the ventral root of a spinal nerve were cut, what would happen to the region that the nerve supplies? So remember, from the ventral horn, you get motor efferent neurons and their axons. So if you're a motor efferent axon, you're going to be serving a skeletal muscle. So what would happen if you cut that ventral root? You would get a complete loss of voluntary movement in your skeletal muscle. Okay. I don't think we talked about this yet, but the spinal nerves emerge from the vertebral column via the intervertebral foramina. So where you have 2 vertebrae stacked one on top of the other, you have an opening that the spinal nerve exits from, so right here, and that's called an intervertebral foramina. Okay, and then just some more notes. We've talked about this. The ventral roots contain axons of motor neurons whose cell bodies are located here in the ventral horn. And then the dorsal roots, so dorsal root here, contain the axons of sensory neurons, but their cell bodies, the sensory neurons, the cell bodies of the sensory neurons are here in the DRG, or dorsal root ganglia. So each spinal nerve, so remember we've got the rootlets of the spinal nerve, then we have the ventral root and the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. Where those two converge, you have a spinal nerve, and then at that point, the spinal nerve branches into the dorsal ramus of the spinal nerve and the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve. And then the ventral rami, so these guys right here, the ventral rami, go on to form nerve networks called plexuses. And you guys have been studying those plexuses, but we'll have some cartoons to talk about that. The dorsal rami, so this guy right here, the dorsal rami or a dorsal ramus, extends posteriorly or dorsally to supply your back muscles and your skin. And then there is so the dorsal ramus is here, the dorsal ramus, and then there's, as it branches, it gets more and more names, but one of them is the meningeal branch of the dorsal ramus. So let's see. So the dorsal ramus is here, the dorsal ramus branches is here, and then it branches here, and this is the meningeal branch of the dorsal ramus. Okay, so we've gone over this, and we talked about this. So here's this area is the brachial plexus, and the ventral rami of the spinal nerve form these networks called plexuses, and there's 4 plexuses. There's the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. There's no thoracic plexus, so don't be tricked on that if you get a test question. So this is a cross section of the thorax, showing the main roots and branches of a spinal nerve. So let's get our bearings. So this is the sternum. So this would be anterior this way, and then back here would be posterior. Here's a vertebra. Here's a vertebra too that's cut. Here's the spinal cord and the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. Here's the ventral root of the spinal nerve, and they come here to form the spinal nerve. And then this important nerve, it's called the intercostal nerve. It supplies information to your diaphragm so that you can breathe. So that's kind of an important nerve. So let's see what we got here. Ventral rami of T2 through T12. So the ventral ramus of a spinal nerve would be right here. They extend anteriorly, so this one right here, as intercostal nerves. And the intercostal nerves supply muscles of the ribs, thorax, abdominal walls, and the skin, and the diaphragm. And then the dorsal rami, so these guys that are going back here, here's a dorsal ramus, here's a dorsal ramus, they bring motor efferent axons to the back muscles in your skin. So these are all like cross sections of your back muscles, different back muscles. So here's a cartoon of the cervical plexus. So C1 through C5. You can see there's a lot of branching. It's the spinal nerve comes out and branches, forms a ventral rami, and then those ventral rami branch, and that basically forms a plexus. And then here's all the nerves that you should know from those plexuses, and that's on your study guide for the lab practical exam. But importantly for the lecture exam, there is a phrenic nerve in the cervical plexus here that innervates the diaphragm and allows you to breathe. So here's the cartoon of the brachial plexus. So we've got C4 through T1, and starting at the spinal cord, you have, once you form a ventral ramus, then you are called, well actually the ventral rami, when you're talking about a plexus, is called a root. So you go from roots, so these guys, so you go from roots, and then you morph into a trunk, and then you morph into a anterior and posterior division, and then you become a cord. So that's basically just terminology of the plexus. So here's the cartoon of the brachial plexus with including the radial nerve, musculocutaneous nerve, ulnar nerve, and median nerve, and all the branches of those major nerves in the brachial plexus. Oh, and here's the axial nerve. So just a couple things to note. Striking your funny bone is actually stimulating the ulnar nerve in the elbow region. So the ulnar nerve is right in here. So when you hit that, say you hit your funny bone, you're really hitting the ulnar nerve. It's painful. And then another thing to note, the musculocutaneous nerve, so this guy right here, is going to innervate the biceps brachii and the brachioradialis. And then you can see that the radial nerve, so the radial nerve in green, the radial nerve, the ulnar nerve here, and the median nerve here. So if you trace all those three nerves back, you trace it into the brachial plexus. So all of those nerves are in the brachial plexus. And then if you've ever heard of carpal tunnel syndrome, that's your median nerve here. Carpal tunnel syndrome is when that median nerve gets compressed. So in our tour of plexuses, here's the lumbar plexus. So here you have the ventral rami, and then you come out and from the ventral rami and form the nerves of the lumbar plexus. So the posterior side of the thigh, so here the thigh, the leg, and the foot is all served by the tibial nerve. And it's not shown in this cartoon because this is an anterior view, and the tibial nerve will serve the thigh, leg, and foot posteriorly. And then the femoral nerve here is one of the major nerves in the lumbar plexus. And it's over here too, the femoral nerve. You can see how thick that is, the femoral nerve, major nerve of the lumbar plexus. So a little bit more on the lumbar plexus. Arises from L1 and through L4, so lumbar 1 through lumbar 4. The lumbar plexus will overlap with the sacral plexus, and then it just tells you here the femoral nerve. We already said that was an important nerve in the lumbar plexus. It will innervate your quadriceps muscles and the skin of your anterior thigh. And then this obturator nerve will innervate all your adductor muscles. Here's the sacral plexus, and just shows you the nerves of the sacral plexus. The superior gluteal nerve, you probably heard your glutes, so it goes to your gluteal muscles. So superior and inferior gluteal, tibial nerve, and then here's a famous one. Oh, my sciatica. When the sciatic nerve gets pinched, that's quite